When a quiet widow discovers a faded photograph hidden in her late husband's Bible, her world shatters into a labyrinth of secrets and silent heroism. One day at his military funeral, a mysterious mourner appears, a tearful stranger whose presence hints at a past far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. Before we begin, let us know where you're reading from, and if you believe in the power of uncovering hidden truths to transform a life, hit that like button and subscribe for more. In the hush of a cool English morning, before the earth had fully warmed to the sun, a widow named Judith Calloway found a photograph that cracked open half a century of secrets. For decades, she believed her husband Albert was a straightforward man, a dependable presence who served in the British Army during the Cold War but never seemed haunted by it. He came home with medals and scars that were more emotional than physical, and when pressed, he'd only offer unremarkable tales of logistics and routine. Yet now, standing by his freshly turned grave, she found herself confronted by a stranger, a grief-stricken figure with tears too fierce to be casual. In that moment, everything she had ever known about her life shifted. Stay until the end. What would you do if the person you loved most had lived an entirely different life right under your nose? Judith's life, up until Albert's funeral, had been a study in gentle repetition. Each morning, she rose before dawn, made a cup of tea, and traced her fingers over the photograph of her wedding day that hung on the living room wall. It was an old sepia-toned print from the early 1960s, showing her in a simple gown and Albert in his army dress uniform. They looked so happy. Back then, she had teased him about being shy, even though he stood so tall and unflinching. She chalked it up to the vestiges of a military bearing, though she always suspected there was something more, a quiet chamber in his mind that he never allowed anyone else to enter. Still, they enjoyed nearly 5 decades of marriage, punctuated by children, the heartbreak of a late miscarriage, the joys of grandchildren, and the everyday routines that meld 2 souls into one. On the day of Albert's funeral, the sky was bright but deceptively cold. Judith wore a heavy black coat over her simple black dress. Their son David stood beside her, holding her elbow gently to steady her. The ceremony was arranged in the veterans section of the local cemetery. The service included a lone bagpiper, a rifle salute, and that solemn moment when the folded flag was handed to her by a uniformed officer who offered a stiff salute of respect. She felt tears gather in her eyes, but she kept her composure. Albert always preferred subdued emotions to theatrical shows of grief. Despite her grief, she couldn't help noticing the man in the back row. He stood a little straighter than the others, wore a trim black suit, and there was something about his shoes, polished with a near-military perfection. Although elderly, he carried himself with a posture that spoke of years of standing at attention. But what truly caught her breath was the depth of his sorrow. His head hung low, and his shoulders trembled with each sob. It wasn't the tears of someone who had lost a casual acquaintance. It felt personal. It unnerved her, but she could hardly step away from her family to ask a strange mourner how he knew her husband. By the time the last note from the bagpipes drifted into silence and everyone turned to file past the grave, the man had vanished. Judith spent the following days in that surreal mix of heartbreak and duty that follows the death of a spouse. She fielded phone calls from friends, responded to cards and flowers, and tried to keep herself occupied. Quiet moments pressed tears to her eyes, but she found as much solace as she could in busy hands, sorting, cleaning, and cataloging the small personal effects Albert had left behind. Life insurance policies, a military pension, a few medals she recognized from his service, and then there was the Bible on his bedside table. Albert's Bible was a King James version, the same one he'd owned since long before they married. He used to say that the good book had gotten him through the uncertainty of the Cold War. She opened it absently, flipping through passages underlined in pencil, scanning his neat handwriting in the margins. Then, near the center, between Psalms and Proverbs, she felt something thin and flimsy brushing her fingertips. She paused, gently pried the pages apart, and discovered a black and white photograph tucked inside. 2 young men in British Army uniforms, both grinning as if sharing a private joke. By the cut of their uniforms and the overall style, It looked as though it could have been taken in the late 1950s. One man was undeniably Albert. Though in his 20s, his jawline and bright eyes were unmistakably the husband she knew. But the other man almost made her drop the photo in shock. It was him, the mourner from the funeral. The same posture, the same face, just younger and beaming with life. She must have stared at that photograph for nearly an hour. At first, she felt a bewildered confusion. Could it be an old friend of Albert's? A cousin she'd never met? But why had he shown up at the funeral in such a secretive way, only to leave before the service ended? Something didn't sit right. Judith began to wonder if she ever truly knew what Albert had done in the army. Was it possible that her kind, quiet husband had lived a life that was far more clandestine than he ever revealed? When her son David came by that afternoon with groceries and a sympathetic ear, she showed him the photo. He squinted at it, recognized Albert, and frowned when she pointed at the other man. She explained about seeing him at the funeral, how overcome with emotion he seemed. David knew better than to shrug it off. He too sensed that there was something more to the story. Without hesitation, he suggested she contact the Veterans Office, or possibly look for a historian who specialized in the Cold War. This wasn't just some old army buddy who stayed in contact. This man had clearly avoided their family for decades and then appeared only when Albert was laid to rest. It was both chilling and strangely poignant. Judith took David's advice. She called the local veterans office and asked if they might have any record of a man who served with her husband, someone who matched the age and appearance of the man in the photo. Perhaps his name was on some official roster, or maybe there were photos from the old regiments. But the officer who answered the phone was polite yet unhelpful. They had no files referencing such a person alongside Albert Calloway. He recommended she request Albert's full service history. Maybe something in that file would provide a clue. Judith did just that, filling out the necessary forms and waiting for a response. 3 weeks later, she received a letter that left her more confused than ever. Certain parts of Albert's service record were still classified. The note explained, apologetically, that he had worked in intelligence, meaning some documents would be restricted until they were fully declassified by the Ministry of Defense. Judith stared at that letter for a long time, feeling as if the foundations of her world had begun to tilt. Albert, an intelligence operative. That made no sense. He used to joke about boxes and maps, about how he spent more time counting supplies and verifying checklists than doing anything exciting. How many times had she teased him about not having any real war stories to share? Fretting and uncertain, she finally followed her son's suggestion to contact a military historian who might have some insight. David found a reference to a Dr. Edward Finley, a retired intelligence archivist who specialized in Cold War espionage. It took several phone calls and a personal favor from a friend of a friend, but eventually Judith made an appointment. Dr. Finley agreed to meet her in a small cafe near his home. The day of the meeting, she dressed in a modest blouse and skirt, trying to look put together despite her anxiety. She carried with her the photograph of Albert and the mysterious man, and she clutched it with a kind of desperate hope that it would yield answers. Dr. Finley turned out to be a soft-spoken, older gentleman with kind eyes. She introduced herself, explained her situation, and hesitantly handed him the photo. His reaction was immediate. He inhaled sharply, lifting his eyebrows in surprise, then adjusted his glasses and leaned in closer. "That's Operation Krosky," he said at last, quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Judith had no idea what that was, so she waited, letting him gather his thoughts. He glanced up at her. Operation Krosky was a joint mission between the UK and West Germany in 1958. It involved deep surveillance on the eastern side of Berlin. Very dangerous assignment. Agents were essentially living on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, gathering intelligence and sending coded transmissions back west. Judith felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Are you certain that's this mission?" He nodded gravely. "There aren't many photographs of the operatives. But this one, I've seen it before in old MI6 archives. Possibly an internal file that was mostly redacted. The two men in this photo were rumored to have been among the agents who penetrated East German military intelligence." Judith's mind reeled. The man on the left is my husband, Albert. But I only ever knew him as someone who worked in logistics. That's no ordinary logistics officer, Finley said gently. He would have been gathering data on troop movements, supply lines, infiltration routes. This operation was one of the more dangerous ones. People vanished behind the Berlin Wall all the time. He tapped the other man in the photo. And that's James Archer, a British operative who went missing in 1961. The official story was that he died in a safe house bombing. But there were rumors he survived, living under a new identity. Nothing was ever confirmed. Judith's lips parted. Her mind flickered back to the funeral. Could it really be James Archer? He was at Albert's funeral. He looked devastated. Finley leaned back in his seat, letting out a breath. If that's truly James Archer, he would have known your husband under field aliases. They might have saved each other's lives any number of times. But why is it still classified? Cold War files, especially ones involving Berlin, can remain sealed for decades. Some identities were never officially acknowledged. He fixed her with a serious look. I suspect your husband never wanted you caught up in that part of his life. She couldn't help tearing up. Albert, her sweet, steady husband, had hidden something monumental from her, but she also felt a flicker of pride. He'd done something important and possibly heroic. He had risked his life for reasons he never even boasted about. That was so very Albert. Dr. Finley offered to help her navigate the labyrinth of partially unsealed intelligence documents. Over the next few weeks, he made calls, went through old archives, and pored over newly declassified materials. Judith sat beside him in cramped reading rooms with stale fluorescent lights, scanning endless lines of typewritten reports that smelled faintly of dust and age. Some pages were blacked out, entire paragraphs missing. Others contained only coded references that neither of them could decipher. But then they stumbled upon a mission briefing from 1958 that mentioned Operation Kroski by name. The briefing described 2 embedded agents in East Berlin, codenamed Foxglove and Starling, who were to infiltrate East German military circles. Foxglove. The code name leaped out at Judith like a spark in the darkness. In a separate personnel list, the name Foxglove was aligned with an unidentified officer, real name unknown, later presumed Kia in 1961. A single note suggested the identity might have been A. Calloway. Judith's heart pounded as she read those words. A. Calloway. Albert Calloway. Her gentle husband who would rather fix the neighbor's squeaky gate than brag about old adventures. He had been Foxglove, an undercover operative in the thick of one of the most dangerous areas in Europe. She felt numb. Why hadn't he told her any of this? After all, they were married for decades. They had built a life together, shared every heartbreak and joy. How could he keep this from her? The realization stung, but at the same time, a part of her understood. Perhaps he wanted to protect her from the dark corners of that world. Perhaps he himself wanted to forget. Still, it changed everything she thought she knew about him. Their next discovery unsettled her even more. Buried in a stack of debrief transcripts from 1962, Finley found mention of a man who came to a checkpoint in Vienna, claiming to be James Archer. He was reportedly burned and limping using a fake name. The transcript was heavily redacted, but a few sentences glowed with significance. He got me out. The whole building came down. I ran. He didn't. I owe him everything. If I ever make it back, tell Foxglove I kept the promise. Judith shivered as she read those words. If this was indeed James Archer, he believed Albert, Foxglove, had either sacrificed himself or been left behind when something catastrophic happened. But Albert had evidently survived in some manner, gone on to live a normal life in England, married, fathered children, and never breathed a word about these events. What was the promise Archer had vowed to keep? Dr. Finley, for all his expertise, could only offer speculation. Possibly they were pinned down in a safe house, the East German Stasi or some paramilitary group attacked, bombs or gunfire forced them to flee. One agent escaped. The other was presumed dead. Intelligence agencies often preferred finality. Better to mark an operative Kia than admit to a messy, half-known fate. Archer apparently disappeared from official records after the checkpoint incident in Vienna. Judith suspected he spent the rest of his life in hiding or adopting new identities to stay safe from retribution. And yet he'd emerged for Albert's funeral, as though he couldn't let his comrade rest without paying respects. Driven by that gnawing sense of unfinished business, Judith wrote letters and emails to a half-dozen foreign embassies, British consulates, and veterans organizations, explaining that she sought a James Archer who might have served with her husband. She attached the photograph and any relevant details Finley had helped her uncover. Most of the responses were sympathetic but offered nothing new. Others never replied. As the weeks turned into a month, she began to accept that maybe the mysterious man was gone for good, or living off the grid for reasons of his own. She felt torn. Part of her needed closure, but another part of her feared whatever truths might come from speaking with him. Then, on a drizzly afternoon, an envelope arrived at her door. It was unremarkable, save for the careful, slightly shaky handwriting of someone trying to keep letters neat. She opened it and read, "Mrs. Calloway, I've waited decades to send this. Your husband was the reason I made it out of Berlin alive. He told me once that, if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure someone told the truth. But I never had the courage. Until now, he saved my life, and gave up his. Please forgive the silence. It wasn't cowardice. It was grief. James Archer." Judith let out a tiny, shuddering gasp. So it was true. He was James Archer, the man from the photograph, and presumably the same man who had vanished in 1961. This letter was more than a confession. It was an olive branch. Judith wrote back immediately, giving him her phone number and address, telling him she wasn't angry or frightened. She simply needed to know more about Albert's past, to understand the man she'd loved. A week later, a small car pulled up outside her home. Through the lace curtains of her living room, she saw an elderly gentleman stepping carefully out of the driver's seat. He wore a dark overcoat, and though his hair was thinner and grayer, his frame was unmistakable. She hurried to the porch and opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, unsure of how to begin. Finally, Archer bowed his head slightly, almost in apology, and she gestured for him to come inside. They sat on the porch because the afternoon was mild, the scent of rain still in the air. Archer looked at her with an intensity that reminded her of Albert, that old soldier's poise. He apologized for intruding on her life, admitted that he had come to the funeral but lost his nerve when he saw the ceremonial honors. He said that seeing Albert's coffin, draped in the flag, rekindled memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. Judith listened, heart pounding. She offered him tea, and he accepted with a quiet, "Thank you," hands trembling slightly as he lifted the cup. At first, he spoke in halting phrases, perhaps unsure of how much to say. But little by little, the dam broke. He told her about East Berlin in 1958, the stench of tension everywhere, the danger of being found out. He told her how Albert was not just physically brave but also brilliant with ciphers and coded transmissions. They used dead drops, shortwave signals, and memorized codes that changed every month. Albert, Foxglove, had an uncanny knack for making sense of complex intel about Soviet troop deployments and suspicious arms stockpiles. Archer recalled that in their downtime, Albert would murmur about a girl back home, Judith. He carried a small photo of her in his wallet, showed it to Archer once, and said, "She's the reason I'm coming out of this alive." Judith felt tears prick her eyes. She realized that while she was busy working a modest job in a local library and waiting for Albert to come home, he had been skulking through the gray gloom of East Berlin with a loaded sidearm under his coat, decoding stolen dispatches that could trigger international crises if discovered. The magnitude of what he risked swept over her like a wave. Archer described the fateful night in 1961. They were holed up in a safe house, just a dilapidated apartment building used as a rendezvous point. They had vital intelligence about Soviet missile placements in the eastern sector. But the Stasi had gotten wind of them. Archer remembered frantic whispers, the sound of footsteps in the stairwell, the barked orders in German. Before they could escape, an explosion rocked the building. Archer was thrown clear of the main blast, but Albert had been near the epicenter. In the chaos, Archer fled. Days later, with a broken leg and burns on his arms, he showed up at a checkpoint in Vienna, certain that Foxglove was dead. That was the last official record of him. He'd lived in shame and heartbreak, half convinced he should have fought harder to save Albert. Judith struggled to process the idea that Albert had somehow survived that bombing. Archer looked as though he wrestled with the same astonishment to this day. "I heard rumors," he admitted, voice trembling, "that Foxglove wasn't killed, that he'd found a way out. I never knew if it was true, until I saw a small note in an obscure intelligence briefing that referred to an agent repatriated under heavy secrecy. The name was redacted, but I suspected. Then years went by. I changed identities so many times, and I didn't know where to look for him. When I finally tracked him down, under his real name, Albert Calloway, so many decades had passed. I thought I'd spook him if I showed up unannounced. I tried to send messages, but I always lost my nerve. I carried so much guilt." They sat in silence for a moment, letting the enormity of it sink in. The man in front of her was nearly the same age as Albert had been, both old soldiers battered by time. For a flicker of a moment, Judith felt something akin to anger. Why had he never reached out to them sooner? But that feeling quickly turned into understanding. He was a man who believed he'd left his best friend to die. The weight of that guilt would have been suffocating. Archer took a sealed envelope from his coat and handed it to Judith. Inside was another photograph, this one creased, faded from years of being folded and unfolded, but still recognizable. It was Judith and Albert on their wedding day. On the back, in her husband's neat handwriting, were the words, "If this ever finds you, then I kept my promise. Foxglove." She stared at it for a long, trembling moment, tears sliding down her cheeks. Albert had always been an enigma in small ways. Quiet, introspective, prone to midnight walks when insomnia struck. But he was also the warm, caring father who once built a treehouse for David, the man who never forgot their anniversary. Now she realized how those two halves of him were bound by an intense sense of loyalty and sacrifice. They talked all afternoon, the porch steps turning chilly beneath their feet as the sun dipped lower. Judith found herself smiling through her tears when Archer recounted silly anecdotes. Albert making jokes in the field, or trying to cook with limited rations, or humming an old English lullaby to calm his nerves during a crackdown by the East German police. Some of these details felt more intimately familiar to her than the stories from official archives. She realized that here, finally, was a piece of Albert's life that she had never been privy to, shared by the one person who had walked that path with him. Eventually, Archer sighed and admitted he must leave soon. He was still cautious, living under layers of assumed identities. He didn't name them or explain precisely why, but she guessed that old threats or simply old fears drove him to keep his head down. Yet he had finally found the courage to show his face, honor Albert, and let Judith know who her husband really was. Before he left, he reached out and gently took her hands in his. "He loved you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Even in the darkest hours, when we were certain we'd be found and executed, he'd say, 'I need to get home to her.' You kept him alive, in more ways than you could imagine." Judith couldn't stop crying, but these tears felt different. Less like despair, more like a release. She thanked Archer for coming, and in response, he bowed his head again. "I owed him," he whispered. "He gave me my life back. I wish I could have told him that." After Archer left, Judith sat on the porch long after the daylight faded, the photograph of her wedding day still resting on her lap. She pictured Albert's face, the warmth in his eyes, the way his lips curved when he smiled at her. The puzzle pieces of his life were finally falling into place. Yes, he had been Foxglove. Yes, he had risked everything in clandestine missions, saved a friend, and nearly lost his own life. But he had come back to her, quietly, discreetly, as though putting a seal on that chapter of his life. She felt a strange sense of peace mingled with lingering questions. Why never tell her? Had he not trusted her, or had he simply wanted to protect her from the burdens of espionage? Perhaps she'd never know the exact reason. But she knew one thing: his love had been real. So real, in fact, that it had stitched his two worlds together. The dark labyrinth of Berlin and the light of his life with her. In the following weeks, Judith found her sorrow transforming into a deeper understanding. She still grieved her husband, but now she was discovering the magnitude of who he was and what he had done. She revisited the archives with Dr. Finley, though they found little else that was not heavily redacted. Still, the faint references to Foxglove were enough to confirm that his service had been extraordinary. For her part, Judith decided not to press the Ministry of Defense for more files. Maybe one day they would fully declassify Operation Krosky, but for now, she had learned enough to fill the empty space in her heart. Her son David, who had been supportive throughout, was stunned when she told him the entire story. An undercover mission, the survival of James Archer, the final note on the back of the wedding photo. Yet the shock soon gave way to admiration and even a touch of awe. "Dad," he said, shaking his head. "He was a hero, wasn't he?" Judith hesitated. "Yes," she said softly. "He was." She appreciated that her son's memory of his father might shift from that of a quiet retiree to that of a secret soldier. And she felt proud, in a bittersweet way. To make sense of it all, Judith wrote a journal. She poured out every detail she had learned, from the day of the funeral to the day Archer arrived. She included the scraps from the transcripts, the code names, the rumors of how they slipped behind enemy lines. In a way, it was her method of grieving. Each word she wrote connected her more deeply to Albert's hidden past. She didn't blame him anymore for concealing such a massive part of his life. Perhaps he had done so out of necessity, sworn to secrecy by official acts, or perhaps out of a personal need to safeguard her from the memories that haunted him. She reminded herself that the best marriages hold mysteries even in their ordinary scope. That's part of the wonder of loving another human being. A month after Archer's visit, Judith received one more letter. It was shorter this time, a simple note. "Mrs. Calloway, I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to have one last piece of history." This was Albert's original coded notebook from 1958. "I kept it all these years as a way to remember him. Now it belongs with you. My deepest respect always, James Archer." Enclosed was a slim notebook with a battered cover, the pages inside scrawled with strange sequences of letters and numbers, interspersed with the occasional doodle of a flower or a random phrase in German. She recognized her husband's handwriting immediately. On the inside cover, in neat script, Albert had written, "If we don't come home, at least let the truth be known. Foxglove and Starling." She pressed the notebook to her chest, tears escaping her eyes once more. She felt a keen sense of closure, as if Albert himself had left her this relic to say, "Yes, this was who I was. Now you know." She never heard from Archer again after that second letter. She understood his need to remain elusive, and she wished him peace. In her mind, he stood as a testament to the bond that can form in desperate circumstances. Two men risking their lives for a cause that was never advertised or celebrated publicly. She hoped that, wherever he was, he found the same measure of understanding she had found. In time, Judith took down the single wedding photograph from its place on the living room wall and replaced it with two photographs, side by side on the mantel. One was the black and white photo of Albert and Archer in their army uniforms, both young and full of laughter, oblivious to the hardships they would soon face. The other was the faded wedding picture that Archer had returned to her, the back still bearing Albert's penned words. She liked the idea of them existing in tandem, representing the two halves of her husband's life. She also stopped wearing black. There was no reason to remain in mourning's color when she felt a kind of warmth radiating from all she had discovered. Instead, she took Albert's old watch, the same one he wore in the photograph with Archer, and began wearing it daily. It was heavy on her wrist at first, but over time she grew accustomed to the weight. She noticed that sometimes at night, when she held it to her ear, the ticking sounded louder than usual, as though it were telling her that life goes on, that secrets do not negate love, and that the man she married was true to her in every way that mattered. She found a quiet joy in sharing her story with those close to her. She told David in more detail how Albert had navigated East German intelligence circles under the name Foxglove. She recounted Archer's testimony of how Albert cracked codes late into the night, fueled by thoughts of his young wife waiting for him back home. David's eyes shone with admiration, and more importantly, with a renewed understanding of the father he had lost. She sometimes wondered if she should write a book about it, but she wasn't sure the world needed to know every detail. Some secrets might still be better left in the shadows. She also suspected official censors would pounce on any attempt to publicly reveal aspects of Operation Krosky still considered off-limits. In the end, she decided the best repository for her discoveries was her own heart. Yet unanswered questions lingered in the corners of her mind. How exactly did Albert survive the bombing in Berlin? Did he slip through rubble and find safe passage west? Or was he covertly evacuated by Allied forces? Did he have to bargain with certain intelligence officers, giving them partial information in exchange for his freedom? Judith's imagination filled with harrowing scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. But she realized that she might never know the precise truth of those events, and perhaps Albert himself had tried to forget them. In a strange way, leaving those questions unanswered kept a portion of his memory alive. There was a mystique about him that felt oddly comforting, a reminder that some parts of a person's soul remain known only to themselves and, perhaps, one trusted friend. She visited his grave at least once a week, often bringing a small foxglove flower to lay by the headstone. When asked by neighbors or family why that particular flower, she'd smile and say, "It was special to Albert." Only David knew the real reason behind that delicate bloom. Those moments at the cemetery were peaceful. She would stand there, watch the breeze ripple the grass, and imagine him standing beside her, still wearing that army uniform in her mind's eye, as upright and quietly strong as he had been in youth. Curiosity did prompt her to contact a few of Albert's old army acquaintances she found through various channels. She asked them discreetly if they knew about his intelligence role. Most responded with confusion. They only remembered him as a competent logistician, the go-to man for supplies, maps, and the complicated paperwork that dogged every unit. It reaffirmed that Albert's cover story was robust. One man recalled that Albert occasionally disappeared on short-notice assignments, which he shrugged off as special missions. But none claimed to know details, reinforcing the idea that his infiltration work was deeply compartmentalized. Judith marveled at how her husband could maintain such a normal facade in everyday army life, earning promotions, forging friendships, all the while slipping behind the Iron Curtain on missions nobody knew existed. In her free time, she read books about Cold War Berlin, fascinated by the stories of infiltration, the ground-level tension between East and West, and the personal bravery of those who moved in the shadows. She would read about a clandestine operation or a near miss at Checkpoint Charlie, and she'd think, Albert was there, in that environment, risking everything. It made her appreciate the relative safety of their home life all the more. She remembered how, when he came home from the army, he seemed to have a knack for noticing small details others missed, like the slight limp in a neighbor's step or the unusual pattern of footprints in fresh snow. At the time, she assumed he just had sharp eyes. Now she saw it in a different light, a trained operative forever vigilant for anomalies. Despite the swirl of espionage revelations, she never lost sight of the Albert she knew. The man who surprised her with roses on her birthday, who taught David to fish in the local pond, who sang lullabies to their granddaughter. He was the same man, and that realization comforted her more than anything. The hush of secrets he carried did not negate the genuine love and devotion he showed her. In a sense, it amplified it. To remain so gentle after having lived through violence and betrayal, surely that spoke volumes about his character. As the first anniversary of Albert's death approached, Judith decided she wanted to do something special to honor him. She thought of planning a small gathering of close friends and family, something quiet. Then she had a notion. What if she attempted to invite James Archer too? It was a long shot. He had made it clear he needed to remain elusive. But she wrote him one more letter, explaining that she would hold a small remembrance at her home, a time to share stories about Albert. If Archer could manage it without risking his safety, she would love for him to come. She received no reply. The day came and went, the living room filled with people who toasted Albert's memory, laughed over warm anecdotes, and offered condolences to Judith. It was a lovely afternoon, both joyous and tinged with sorrow. She had arranged on a side table the 2 key photographs and a sprig of foxglove in a simple glass vase. Often, The guests paused there, studying the young faces in the black and white photo, murmuring about how dashing and brave they looked. For a few minutes, Judith pictured Archer stepping through the door, quietly slipping in to pay his respects. But that never happened. She understood. It was enough that he had come once already, revealing the biggest truth of Albert's life. Perhaps that was all he was able to do. Summer turned into autumn, leaves swirling in golden piles along the sidewalks. Judith kept up her routine, volunteering at the local library, visiting David and his family, cherishing her quiet morning tea. But each day felt a bit less burdened by grief. She began to dream of Albert less often, though sometimes she had the comforting sense that he was near, a gentle presence reminding her to live. One late October evening, she was in bed reading a novel when she drifted off and dreamt of a corridor lined with old photographs of soldiers, each door leading to a room of hidden stories. Albert stood at the end of the corridor, wearing that uniform from the photograph with Archer. He beckoned to her with a smile, then opened a door and walked inside. She hurried after him, but by the time she reached the door, it was locked. She woke up, tears on her cheeks, but not from despair, rather from the sense that he was at peace. In the middle of winter, the British government's declassification schedules advanced another batch of Cold War files. Dr. Finlay reached out to Judith, asking if she wanted to look. At first, she hesitated, her heart twisting at the thought of discovering more unsettling details. But curiosity and that lingering desire for thorough closure compelled her to agree. They visited the archives together. Finlay checked the registry for references to Operation Crosskey, Foxglove, Starling, or James Archer. This time, they found a heavily redacted intelligence assessment from late 1961, referencing an escaped operative believed to be Foxglove, with injuries consistent with the safe house explosion. The unredacted parts showed that the operative was quietly repatriated and given a new assignment with the British Army under a recognized alias. The rest of the pages were black bars of classified text. They also found mention of a rumored second operative, codenamed Starling, Archer, who might have survived, though official records declared him dead. No conclusive follow-up was documented. Reading between the lines, Judith realized that the official stance was to close the file and allow these men to vanish from the official record. It was safer for them and simpler for the government. She felt grateful that at least a kernel of truth was hidden within the endless bureaucratic paragraphs. That, yes, Albert was brought home and granted a quiet life in the Army's logistics branch until his eventual retirement. He hadn't lied to her so much as he had omitted the darkest chapters. Perhaps that was the only way to move forward. Leaving the archives, Judith felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The question of how exactly Albert survived might remain locked behind black ink forever. But the intangible confirmation was there. He had done his duty, endured more than most could imagine, and then chosen a simple family life. For that, she respected him all the more. Her circle of friends, mostly unaware of the labyrinthine journey she'd undertaken, sometimes wondered aloud how she managed to find peace after losing a spouse of 46 years. She would smile softly and say, "He left me a gift," though she rarely elaborated. Indeed, in her mind, the gift was the knowledge that he had loved her so fiercely. He had lived a double life partly for her sake, to ensure she had no part of that danger, that she was shielded from the dark corners of international conflict. He had chosen silence over stirring up old nightmares. Now, with Archer's help, that silence had gently been replaced by truth, yet not a truth so harsh as to overshadow his genuine devotion. One crisp spring morning, exactly 1 year and 6 months after Albert's funeral, Judith woke before dawn, as was her habit. She made her tea and sat by the window. Outside, the garden was starting to bloom with early flowers. She noticed the foxglove seeds she had planted along the fence line were growing tall, delicate spires forming. Birds chirped softly, heralding the sunrise. She sipped her tea and closed her eyes. She could almost hear Albert's voice, softly humming that lullaby Archer said he used to sing in Berlin. She rose from her chair, walked to the mantel, and adjusted the two photographs a bit closer to each other. Albert's watch, strapped to her wrist, ticked steadily. She placed her hand gently over the watch face, feeling its persistent rhythm, and breathed in, letting the sense of his presence fill her. She realized she wasn't weighed down by sorrow anymore. Instead, she felt a sense of profound respect for her husband, for the complexities that shaped him, and for the quiet heroism that existed behind his easy smile. Dr. Finley eventually published a scholarly article about early Cold War intelligence missions. He omitted the real names of certain agents, including Foxglove, but he mentioned the extraordinary resilience of two operatives rumored to have been caught in a safe house explosion. Judith read the article, recognized her husband's story in the oblique references, and felt a flicker of pride. She suspected others might never know it was Albert's tale, and that was fine by her. Some secrets could remain half-buried, adding a layer of texture to the pages of history that the world seldom sees. On the second anniversary of Albert's passing, Judith found the courage to open his old trunk of army souvenirs, medals, citations, uniform pieces. She half expected to discover code books or hidden compartments, but everything looked innocent, just the paraphernalia of a career soldier. She took out a neatly folded uniform and pressed it to her face, inhaling the faint scent of mothballs and old fabric. Then she placed it carefully back in the trunk. She didn't need more evidence or hidden tokens. She had Archer's letters, the coded notebook, and her own abiding memories to remind her of who Albert truly was. Sometimes, late at night, Judith pondered the future. She might travel to Berlin someday, walk the remnants of the wall, and imagine Albert slipping through the streets in the hush of midnight. She might stand in the exact places where he risked his life. But perhaps that dream could wait. She found she didn't need to see those sights to feel close to him. She carried his watch, and within it, the ticking of each second was a gentle testament to his enduring presence. Though her heart was at peace, there was still one pang of regret. Never being able to tell Albert that she admired him not just as a husband, father, and friend, but also as a man who undertook a secret mission for the good of others. She wondered sometimes if he'd ever planned to confess it in the twilight of his life. Maybe he had intended to, and illness took him by surprise. But if there was a lesson she carried forward, it was that love transcends secrets. The fact that he'd gone to such lengths, and quietly returned to build a family, spoke volumes of his character. A few months later, David dropped by her house with his wife and children. The grandchildren squealed with delight when they spotted the flowers blooming in her garden. Judith guided them outside, and they all admired the tall stalks of foxglove swaying in a gentle breeze. David threw her a knowing look, and she smiled. In a hushed moment, he asked her if she planned to remove them eventually, worried they might be poisonous if a child handled them improperly. She shook her head gently, trusting she could supervise. Those flowers were more than decorative. They were a living symbol of Albert's invisible footprints left behind. That evening, after the family had gone, Judith sat at her kitchen table, penning a letter she knew she might never send. It was addressed to Albert. In it, she wrote everything she wished she could have told him while he was alive, that she understood, that she forgave him for hiding his second life, that she was proud. She wrote about meeting James Archer, how the man wept at the funeral, how he cherished Albert's memory. She wrote about how the watch ticked louder now, as if propelled by the heartfelt revelations that had come to light. Tears dotted the paper, but her heart felt lighter with each word. When she finished, she placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and tucked it in her desk drawer. Perhaps one day she would burn it as a final act of letting go. For now, it felt enough to simply keep it safe. In the end, the promise Archer had mentioned in that 1962 transcript remained a tantalizing mystery. Judith supposed it might have been something as simple as, "If you make it out, tell my wife I love her." Or perhaps it was more specific. Some vow they made to each other about revealing the truth if one of them didn't survive. Regardless, Archer had fulfilled it in the only way he could. He had shown up at Albert's funeral, offered tears for a fallen comrade, and ultimately given Judith the missing pieces of a puzzle she never knew needed solving. Now, in the present moment, Judith stands in her living room, gazing at the two photographs perched on the mantel. She doesn't need to wear black anymore. Instead, she wears that watch, hearing it tick like a gentle echo of Albert's heartbeat. The light from the window illuminates the pictures, giving them a warm, timeless glow. She closes her eyes and breathes in the serenity of a new day. Albert lived a second life, yes, but he lived it for her, too, driven by love, anchored by devotion. If she listens closely, she can almost hear him whisper, "Keep going. The truth is enough. Love is enough." She steps closer, touching the edge of the black and white photo of Albert and James Archer, two brash young men who ventured into danger with code names and secret missions. Then her hand glides to the wedding photo, where she and Albert stand side by side, newly married and full of hope. She can almost hear the distant echo of bagpipes and the rustle of a military flag folded in the hush of final honors. Through it all, she smiles. What's your theory? Would you want to discover a loved one's hidden past, knowing it might change everything? The truth can be both liberating and haunting, but sometimes love is the strongest thread tying secrets to the light. If it were you, would you have pried deeper, or let the past remain at rest? The choice is never simple, but perhaps the heart already knows the answer. Thanks for watching to the end. Please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like these. See you next time.